Hey everybody, Christopher Beast here, and in today's video we're going to be talking about the Battle of Kyrsten. By analyzing the prop placement on Kyrsten, one can begin to put together a story of what happened on the map in the past. In this video I will be explaining my methodology of figuring out what happened here, as well as my conclusions on what happened in the lore on this map, as well as some of the general implications that this has moving forward. I hope you guys enjoy, and let's just get right into it. Alright, so first we should establish some basics that will be able to help us with our analysis. Primarily the identity of some of these props that we see in the background. Beginning with what's shown here, this is an American or NATO APC. Next, this is a Soviet BMP. This is a Soviet tank. They're going to be characterized by their circular tops. Then we have the NATO tank, which is going to be characterized by its back hatch. And that's really how you're going to be able to tell the difference between the two, because they kind of do look similar to a rough eye. So that's really going to be your best way to tell the difference. So with these main identities done, there is one last reminder we have to understand before getting into this. What we see on these maps is the final condition in which the battlefield is at, meaning it is how everything ended. Meaning when the nukes fell, this is the condition the battlefield was on. This is just something that's going to be important to remember. I will bring this up later. So let's just get into really what this looks like if we take all these identities and plot them on the map. Alrighty, so this is the image we get if we plot everything on the map. There are two things that you need to notice very quickly that are very important to understanding this map. One, Norwegian flags. It needs to be understood that whatever faction the Norwegians are fighting, most likely the Soviets, are not going to let Norwegian flags continue to fly if that faction wins. And since we understand that this is the end point of the battlefield, we need to understand that anywhere there's a Norwegian flag, Norwegian remnants still held control of those regions when the nukes fell. Second thing to understand is that if the nukes fell, then any tanks that were on the field immediately would be left behind. Or the people inside them would die. So what we can understand from that is that if we see tanks that are dead, that are by themselves, it is possible those tanks died from the nuclear annihilation and not exactly any types of combat. With that, we also need to understand the opposite side of that conversation. If we see a tank that is dead and that is near another enemy tank, those two tanks were fighting and that's what killed each other. So we really need to understand cause and effect and really just what that would look like on the battlefield. Part of understanding that cause and effect is understanding that if there are no of a certain country's tanks past a certain limit, then that country simply didn't occupy that territory. Looking at this map, we can clearly see the Soviets were not in the northwestern parts of this map. There's no armor, Soviet armor. There's no signs of the Soviets up there. Yes, there are destroyed NATO tanks, but as I just said, that is very likely the radiation waves. What this means is that we can draw where relatively the extent of the Soviet push was. And that would be shown on this map. However, there's one thing that you have to notice. If these were the Soviet front lines, why are there NATO tanks behind the front lines? And the other thing to notice is, where is that Norwegian flag? With that, we can actually begin to build a composition of how this battle ended, and how, by knowing its end, the battle unfolded, which is what I'm going to show now. Battle likely started with the Soviet forces having held at the river and with Norwegian reinforcements coming from the north. We know these reinforcements never make it because they probably got shelled or bombed by the Russians. But this battle at the river was costly for the Russians, them losing many pieces of armor. This allowed for the NATO column to push down and force the Russians on a retreat. This retreat would continue, and while NATO would lose some armor, ultimately, NATO's forces were able to take the southeastern corner and get the Russians pinned at a small little bridge, raising the Norwegian flag and thus conquering Kyrsten, or reconquering Kyrsten, for the Norwegian army. What does this mean in the grand sense of the lore, though? Well, first things first, we can make the blanket conclusion that the Battle of Kyrsten was a decisive NATO victory. And if you're someone who's following the lore like I have been, you would know that this is not the first NATO victory that we've seen on a map. We've also seen this at bridges, where NATO seemingly did the same thing, pushing south and destroying the Russian defenses that were holding the line here. This makes it pretty clear that leading into nuclear annihilation, the Russian offensive into Norway was sputtering out, and that NATO counteroffensives had begun to destroy the offensive gains made by Russia. There is another important detail I'd like to mention here that has kind of interested me in showing perhaps how grand of a loss Russia was facing here. In this battle, the NATO forces are pushing south. However, in bridges, the NATO forces are pushing north. This could suggest a Russian encirclement, considering that most likely the Russian goal for their war was to take Trondheim. If the Russian offensive is being pincered from both the north and the south while facing the disruptive supply lines of Vigor, it is very likely that that could cause a complete encirclement of the Russian forces besieging Trondheim, which would be a massive loss for the Soviet army. We also know that there were heavy partisan fightings from what we've learned on maps like Vigor, meaning simply the Russian supply lines and armor weren't able to continue the war with NATO much longer, and were likely facing major defeats throughout the front. It's important to remember that south of Kyrsten is Trondheim, and I plan on making a full video on what this means for Trondheim, but keeping all these pieces in mind, I think it's becoming clearer and clearer that the ones who dropped the nuke were likely the USSR. Their failed offensive into Norway was falling apart quickly, as seen by all of these battles where they're decisively losing. And it makes you really wonder where the narrative's going to go from here now that we've seen two clear examples of a Soviet defeat. I hope this video entertained you all, and I hope really that this sparks more greater interest in the background of the lore of the game, because there's a lot being told with these prop placements. And I'm curious to see, moving into future maps, future lore, and future cassettes, if we get to learn more about this pre-war war, and possibly more about, generally speaking, if I'm correct on my guesses. But this has been Christopher Beast. I hope you guys enjoy content like this, and I hope to see you all next time.